Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to Northwestern's Chicago campus for what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful presentation on an admittedly very sober topic. In just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague from the University of Chicago, Ken Moss, who's going to introduce our speaker. But first, I want to just introduce myself and say a little bit about the sponsors of tonight's event. So my name is David Shayevitz. I'm a professor of Jewish history at Northwestern and director of Northwestern's Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. Together with the Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Chicago, we're sponsoring this talk right at the midpoint between Evanston, where Northwestern is located, and Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is located. And so it's wonderful to have folks here in person, the many people who I know are joining us over Zoom. And I want to just say a word or two about the Jewish studies communities at Northwestern and at the University of Chicago for those who are joining us for the first time and are interested in learning more. So at both of these universities, our centers focus on teaching and research and public engagement around topics related to Jewish history, Jewish thought and culture, Jewish literature, Israeli politics and history, Holocaust studies, and much, much more. Courses are for undergraduate and doctoral students for the most part, but we do a huge amount of programming really on a weekly or even monthly basis, targeting the broader Chicago, national, international communities. And so if you're interested in coming to future events like this one, I would strongly encourage you to go to our website at Northwestern, the Greenberg Center's website for the University of Chicago, and learn more about future opportunities to attend events, to get involved, to follow us on social media, to sign up for our email lists, and so on and so forth. It would be wonderful to have future opportunities for all of us to learn together in this lovely community. With that, Professor Ken Moss.
So I'm Ken Moss, Harriet and Ulrich Meyer Professor of Jewish History in the college and Director of the Joyce C. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Chicago. I want to thank our partners at the Crown Center at Northwestern for working with us on this. And of course, I really want to thank our guest. It's an honor to present our guest tonight, someone who is, I think, really a vital voice of very clear-eyed and unflinching analysis in the midst of continuing catastrophe. Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin is a political scientist, a public opinion expert, a political consultant, a policy fellow at the Century Foundation, and a regular columnist, as I think some of you might know, at Haaretz, Haaretz English, where she covers politics, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and foreign affairs. She took her PhD at Tel Aviv University. She's been many things and is many things as a political consultant. She's advised on 9 national campaigns in Israel. As a political researcher, she focuses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, foreign policy, democracy, human rights, and civil rights, and comparative conflict analysis, where she brings to bear regional expertise in many things, not just Israel and Palestine, but the Balkans, Cyprus, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe, and has done a lot of writing and thinking about post-conflict societies, something it would be nice to imagine bears some relevance for our topic tonight, and transitional democracies in 15 countries beyond Israel. I imagine many of you know Dr. Scheindlin's analysis from her extensive publications in such venues as the New York Times, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, New York Review of Books, The New Republic, The New Statesman, among many, many publications. She's amongst the founders of 972 and also has co-hosted several podcasts, including the Tel Aviv Review of Books and the Election Overdose, which I'm sure many of us are feeling today too. Among her recent publications is the important book-length study, monographic study, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, published in September 2023. And she's a board member of A Land for All, an organization advocating peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a 2-state confederation. She lives in Tel Aviv. And her talk tonight is entitled Israel and Palestine, War, Forever War, or Prospects for Peace. So please join me in welcoming our speaker this evening.
Thank you. Let me start off with a sincere thanks to my host, to Kenneth Moss for inviting me, for the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, Nancy Pardee, Mike Phillips, who's been helping the University of Chicago, David Shayevitz, thank you so much. Katie, also, who's been helping out, and other people on the staff. If I haven't mentioned you, my apologies. But thank you for inviting me and hosting me. I was thinking about the title for this talk, Israel and Palestine, War, Forever War, or Prospects for Peace. And as I was preparing this, I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Not because I personally will be able to make the decisions about where we go on these issues, but because I suddenly started to think, who is making these decisions? This is the biggest crisis of my lifetime for Israel and Palestine. It's one of the three most terrible crises of my lifetime in the world: Russia's war in Ukraine, Sudan, the Middle East. Who's taking responsibility for Israel's fighting this war? Israel didn't plan for this war, even though all conflicts that are unresolved and fester eventually escalate. But the government didn't take responsibility to prevent what happened on October 7th. The region might be very well kind of backing into a forever war, which is what we're going to explore. By design or default, I will try to analyze that if I can. And no one in the Israeli government, not the opposition, is discussing the prospects for what we might actually consider peace. And so it feels very much like it's up to us, Israeli citizens, Palestinians, anybody else who's directly affected by this. But it's a very, it's kind of a frightening feeling. And so I come here thinking I want to talk about every possible thing that will affect the future of these items, but I can't. So the overriding question I will try to answer is whether the Middle East is heading for a forever war or whether there are opportunities for de-escalation, even peace in the longer term. I'm going to focus primarily on the Israeli government, politics, and society, but let me just point out there are no passive actors in these conflicts and wars that we're experiencing. Israel isn't the only belligerent, and I'm going to try to bring those in where I have time. But of course, if I tried to analyze deeply each one, we would never leave. As it is, you're in for a lot. Let me just give you a bit of structure so you know what we're going to try to do is I want to talk about the ways in which the current situation we're in, this war from October 7th through the present, is unprecedented. That's the war part, that I think the unprecedented nature of where we are explains why this war is so extreme. Then I'll talk about the ways in which I see continuity. And that leads me to think about the possibilities of a forever war. And I will conclude, well, let's say these are all equally timed, hopefully, with analyzing where we might find opportunities or prospects for peace. So first of all, how did we get into this current war, which is so extreme? I think that the unprecedented nature of what happened on October 7th is a big part of it. The shock, the surprise, everything feels unprecedented. I don't need to go through everything that happened that day, but we know that for Israelis, this was the highest number of casualties in a single day for Israel, for Jews, since the Holocaust, of course. Just to give you some proportion, about the same number, roughly the same number, possibly more people were killed, more Israelis were killed on October 7th than in 4.5 years of the Second Intifada altogether among Israelis. About 1,200 Israelis on October 7th and over 1,000 Israelis during those 4 years from the year 2000 to roughly 2004-5. 250 hostages, many of them civilians. This is something most countries will never know. There are other unprecedented aspects that I think we don't always appreciate that really shook Israel. One, for example, is that Israel has not had a war that involved the loss of its sovereign territory, maybe ever. Even in the War of Independence, Israel conquered more territory. But we're not talking about occupied territory. Since on October 7th, Israel lost control of sovereign areas of the South, okay, not occupied areas. It effectively lost a measure of sovereignty in the North. So Israel is still sovereign in the North, but it's essentially uninhabitable by civilians. Big swaths of its northern border with Lebanon because of Hezbollah's attacks. And that is a sort of loss of sovereignty. Israel's never coped with that situation before. It is currently the longest war in Israel's history since the War of Independence, depending on how you count, right? If you count the War of Independence as starting in May 1948 through July 1949, the last armistice agreement, Israel, the current war is getting there. It's pretty close. If you start the Israel's war or the Israel-Arab war as going back to shortly after the partition plan in late 1947, this current war isn't quite there yet, but it's not that far off. And I think that it's also very possible that Israel will get there. Just look at the other wars that I noted, right? Russia's war in Ukraine is coming on 3 years. Sudan is over close to 2 years. There's no end in sight for either. Another, paradigm-shattering element of this is that Israel's military doctrine has been based on short wars looking mostly at concepts like deterrence, defense, defeat, right? All of those were broken on October 7th. Israel failed to deter, failed to defend its citizens that day, and failed to defeat Hamas, despite all these promises of total victory. So this is a long-term security doctrine that has collapsed and nothing has really replaced it. More unprecedented things. Israel hasn't actually had a multi-front regional war or anything more than a bilateral regional war since 1973. Unless I forgot something, I was thinking about it. I mean, really, it's 50 years. Really not even any international war since the last Lebanon war in 2006. So Israel's not even used to that. And that was the war with Hezbollah. So if all of this is unprecedented from Israel's perspective, that explains why Israel's response is unprecedented. Israel was simply facing, situations that it couldn't comprehend from so many different perspectives. That has led to the greatest assault on Palestinians ever, the highest number of casualties. I think we all know the numbers, but let me go through them so we don't forget. 43,000 Palestinians known to be killed, about 100,000 wounded, but we also don't know the number of indirect deaths. Some doctors have estimated it at 100,000 due to lack of housing care, medical care, et cetera. We can talk about the breakdown of combatants versus civilians, but I don't want to litigate that here because we are mired in an information war and we're not going to solve it here. There has been a destruction, grave obstacles to humanitarian aid, bombing of civilian infrastructure, including destruction of the healthcare system, massive air and ground attacks on major cities. Whole cities have been destroyed in Gaza. The IDF has completed operations in certain cities and then had to go back, cities or refugee camps or towns, because apparently the initial operations, this unprecedented response, wasn't effective enough. And Hamas was able to re-establish itself in certain areas, which is why we're still seeing recurring operations in some of those areas. Another unprecedented area, or what seems unprecedented, is the relationship with the US, Israel's biggest backer. It looks like at many phases, Israel has crossed American red lines with relation to this conflict. The US wanted Israel to move ahead, Israel and Hamas to move ahead towards a new ceasefire hostage release deal after the first one. Both sides were unable to agree to that. I think they roughly share the blame equally. The US wanted Israel to avoid the Rafah operation. Israel went ahead and did it. The US wanted to avoid regional escalation, invested quite heavily in negotiations between, trying to be an envoy or use its envoy to help de-escalate between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, just to remind everybody, started firing on Israel on October 8th in solidarity with Hamas and then tried to link ceasefire to ceasefire. The US was unable to bridge that divide, and Israel has most recently escalated more severely, despite America's rather long-standing preference throughout this war to avoid a major regional conflagration. And the final unprecedented thing that really is objectively unprecedented is that Israel is now in a direct war or exchange of fire with Iran. Remember, Israel and Iran have never been directly at war before. Here we are, after an exchange of direct fire in April, which followed Israel's assassinations. One assassination at that time, several assassinations since of Iranian assets, including even on Iranian soil. Iran sent its biggest missile attack ever on October 1st, earlier this month. Israel felt the need to respond. Nobody knows what will happen next because it's unprecedented. So to summarize why I think we're in an unprecedented situation, for all of those reasons, the gravest attack on so many fronts, so many, multilateral forms of attacks on Israel. Israel felt the need to just keep on fighting, even when its own defense minister from within the government made accusations that the fighting is not strategic enough, the aims, the diplomatic aims are not clearly defined. And even when, some of my colleagues, well-connected analysts, people who speak with top levels of the Israeli government, the American government, were saying things back in like December 2023 that surely the war can't go on much longer because we've all heard from very senior sources that there won't be enough global or diplomatic support for Israel to continue. Nevertheless, what it turned out to be is that there is no global policeman. There's, international courts, international law is sort of working, but not working. It's active, but it's not effective at stopping the war. America has not been effective at stopping the war. There is no responsible adult stopping the war. And these processes militate towards ongoing war for the foreseeable future. Israel has adopted the approach that only force will work to achieve its aims, because I think it hasn't developed a better idea or a different idea right now. Hamas, for its part, clearly thought that only the use of massive, unprecedented force against civilians would put the Palestinian cause back on the map. I'm sorry to say they were right. Okay, I think everybody who's interested has to acknowledge that the Palestinian issue is essentially off the global agenda for a long time. And Iran thought that its ring of fire around Israel through its proxies and militias would keep the strategic depth, right? Keep conflict away from Iran, but that seems to have developed into a force that was out of its control. But I think Iran obviously has responsibility for that. And now it's lost its strategic depth. The war has come to Iran itself. And now we're in this unprecedented situation where both sides are using force. So given how badly all of these paradigms have collapsed, it seems like all the sides involved here are just falling back on force. So much for the unprecedented part. For the precedented part, what is strange is that there are so many areas of continuity in this war. And when we think about whether we're headed for a forever war, let's not be naive, right? We know something about long wars in the Middle East. The conflict did not start on October 7th. And if we're worried about the future forever war, we should learn from the past forever war, the one that's been going on, which we sometimes forgot, either in the world or even in Israel. I don't think Palestinians really forgot it because they were living, most people were affected by it. That's war, conflict, occupation, failed peacemaking. Let me go through some of them. Just to say that one of my first thoughts on October 7th, I mean, none of us can forget where we were, right? If you're here, I assume you all remember where you were. I was abroad. And as it happens, I was abroad covering the aftermath of another conflict in the Caucasus. But one of the first things that went through my mind was, here we go again. We're going to have another cycle of violence. There's going to be a huge military response. We're going to see the continued failure of diplomacy. People's attitudes are going to get worse towards one another. We're going to see ongoing failures of our domestic leaders to try to move us out of these cycles of violence. And so in many ways, these trends continued, bigger, more exaggerated, more severe, but familiar. So let me just walk through them quickly. First, the cycle of violence. Okay, just focusing on Gaza alone, not even talking about the West Bank for now. This was a different kind of attack, to be sure, but it also wasn't the first time that there was an attack in Israeli sovereign territory. Those of us who lived through years of suicide bombings and during the Second Intifada during the 1990s know about this, attacks on civilians. It obviously wasn't the first time there was an escalation in Gaza, or mini war, in which some, the exchange of rocket fire or some event led to a major escalation. Israel uses overwhelming force, lots of destruction, usually air power, but sometimes with a ground operation as well. And so to remind people how many cycles we've had, let me name them. Cast lead, right? The first war between Israel and Hamas, 2008-9, that included a ground operation. Pillar of Cloud, we have colorful names, 2012, a shorter operation without a ground operation. Protective Edge, a much more severe war, over 2,000 Palestinians killed, included a ground operation. That was in 2014. Guardian of the Walls in 2021. That was a major escalation and included violence within Israel. We had two smaller operations, Breaking Dawn in August 2022, Bow and Arrow in May 2023. We know these cycles. We've been through them again and again. Each cycle caused mass devastation. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, during the Second Intifada, the death ratio, and I hate to do traffic in bodies, but it is worth remembering that the death ratio at that time was about 3-to-1 Palestinians to Israelis. Okay, over 3,000 Palestinians were killed during the Second Intifada, over about 1,000 Israelis. Since the early 2010s, Israel has acquired very sophisticated air defense systems. And these wars are often fought from the air, which means that Palestinians die by the hundreds or thousands compared to dozens or sometimes fewer Israeli deaths in total, soldiers and civilians. And I say that just to explain the difference in perceptions of what this means to Israelis versus what it means to Palestinians. After each war with Gaza, and I call them wars just for ease of communication, but some people call them operations or escalations, there is some reversion to the status quo, a version of the status quo. Gaza remains controlled by Hamas. Israel maintains the conditions to maintain Hamas, which we now know, we knew at the time, was very much the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's preference to divide the leadership of the Palestinians so that there wouldn't be pressure for negotiations because no partner, they're divided. Certainly, he didn't want pressure to reach a political resolution, and he definitely didn't want to reach a political resolution based on a Palestinian state because he's opposed that for most of his political history. This situation was coupled by political stagnation, so there was no horizon for the Palestinians in terms of eventually reaching negotiations or final status or a two-state solution. Israel continued its closure policies over Gaza, sometimes turning the dial tighter, sometimes loosening them a little bit, but always severely restricted. Unemployment in Gaza rose to about 45% on the eve of the war, but it had actually been at that level for some years. In the West Bank, we shouldn't forget also about 20% unemployment. The combination of political suppression, right, not having self-determination, huge, a towering sense of a socioeconomic dead end for Palestinians, few opportunities for livelihood, for bettering their position. Those are the ingredients for violence. Those are the ingredients for extremism. The way I see human society, we all have some extremists, some small slice of society. But if you have exacerbating factors, conditions like these, it mobilizes more. It acts as an accelerator. We knew the cycle so well that I wrote the following. We don't have to read the whole thing, but you can see, given our recent history, Gaza is the obvious arena to look for the next war after 4 previous rounds. With Hamas governing, going through some of the data you just saw, the conditions of life are untenable. Even increasing some of the numbers of work permits into Israel, it won't change the overall misery. Hamas is under pressure, and I talked about internal political dynamics and the lack of Palestinian elections. And my conclusion in that particular excerpt was that this makes violence a natural recourse. Most important part of this is the date, February 9th, 2022. Okay, I'm not a prophet. I don't have high-level sources in Hamas. I was just looking at the precedent. Okay, so on that day, my primary thought was I was shocked but not surprised. So in Israel too, let me just say, we also have some continuity in Israel, inside Israel. Certain things never change. Netanyahu's always prime minister, for one thing. And so we have that wall of resistance against Palestinian statehood. That's sort of a feature of Netanyahu's political persona. It's essentially opposition to Palestinian self-determination. It's become more entrenched the longer he's been in power. He first said it openly, I think, in 2015. I mean, openly, he first said it openly as prime minister in 2015, and he's been saying it ever since. And so I think, it's clear where his position on this is. The Palestinian leadership, by the way, is also seeing a lot of continuity. It has been for years divided, atrophied, corrupt, deeply disliked by Palestinians. Just to give you a sense of the data, my colleague Khalil Shikaki, we do public opinion research together. In his most recent poll of Palestinians, which was from September of this year, if elections were held today and there were several presidential candidates, Mahmoud Abbas, the current president, would get 6% of the vote. In a two-way race, he would get 13%. Only 36% support Hamas in party identification. So, but just over a third. I mean, I say only, not to say, it would be nice if nobody supported Hamas, but it's still a minority. This is a deep leadership crisis. Over 84% want Abbas to resign, including 90% in the West Bank, people who actually live under the Palestinian Authority. So this is a profound leadership crisis. The Palestinian leadership remains divided, atrophied, corrupt, and deeply disliked. In other words, that was before. That also is a matter of continuity, even more so because, the situation of the Palestinians really has never been worse. Where else do I see continuity? The role of foreign actors. I get asked all the time, what should America be doing differently? What we've seen is, frankly, the impotence of outside actors to foster or force a change. The US has shown overwhelming political, military, financial support for Israel with a couple of small tweaks. I can talk about it, but at the level of rhetoric and the public image, and even what I mentioned before, a sense of crisis and Israel kind of violating some of the red lines, it looks like Netanyahu has made Israel into a partisan issue in the US. And especially if you look at US surveys, you'll see a big political divide between Republicans and Democrats. Of course, the parties campaign on this as well. By the way, if you look at Israeli surveys, America has become a partisan issue. What do I mean by that? Primarily, mostly for the few times the question about who would you support in American presidential elections is asked, usually you see more support for the Republican, which in recent years is Trump. And that continued during the war. We don't have a lot of surveys. I haven't seen any that dealt with the Harris candidacy, but even at a late stage, Israelis preferred Trump to Biden, despite this overwhelming support. So there have been some small tweaks in American policy. The US has announced sanctions on individual settlers, has delayed a weapons shipment, has issued a very severe recent warning about whether weapons are being used for violations of human rights in contradiction of National Security Memo 20. But these haven't really affected Israel's decision-making in a significant way. Overall, the big picture is that the United States has spent $18 billion on Israel in 2024. According to the Brown University Cost of War Project, that's unprecedented. Under the Memorandum of Understanding under the Obama years, which was signed in 2018, there was a record, 2008. It was signed later on, not 08, later on. That was a record high. So that MOU had a $38 billion 10-year foreign aid package. So $3.8 billion a year. We're up to 18 billion. So you can see that this is actually an unprecedented level of US support, despite what looks sometimes like tension or crisis. I wouldn't actually call it a crisis. In fact, I would say it's more like, the bear hug of Joe Biden for Israel after October 7th became a blank check. The paradigm of unwavering US support has been a matter of continuity, but more so. The US isn't alone, by the way, in being unable to influence Israel's decision-making or bring any of the sides together to de-escalate. The EU has excelled in expressing concern, urgency. There's a whole Twitter feed devoted to verbs like that with the EU. The EU Foreign Policy Chief, Joseph Borrell, told me in an interview he gave me for Haaretz that he basically, when he took office, his staff said, don't touch this issue. It's not worth your time. It can't be solved. And he said, I shouldn't have listened. We basically didn't really put too much attention to it, and there was no excuse for that. Arab states, by the way, especially the Abraham Accord partners, did do something different. They normalized with Israel in 2020. That's a break from the past. It looks like something unprecedented, but there is a continuity factor there as well. The continuity factor was in joining other members of the international community in complacency with relation to the conflict and not putting all of their attention into resolving the conflict. In fact, the Abraham Accords were essentially constructed to try to circumvent the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and marginalize it. There's another major area of continuity that as a pollster I expected, and I was not surprised, but it's worth going through the data of public opinion to show where the publics have gone on some of these issues. Let me just put this simply. War is not good for peace in the public mind. Okay. Some people ask me when Israel is, being gravely attacked and there's so much violence, don't they understand the language of force? And doesn't that make them more willing to compromise? You can find some examples of that. You can argue the point. I have a colleague who has a whole book about it. But I think when it comes to public opinion, certainly over the last 25 years, that is not what we see. Let me give you a few examples of what I consider a barometer question. And that is the question of whether people support a two-state solution. At this point, it's practically a signaler. It's not even really that, realistic in people's minds, but it does show you where people are. And I'm giving you both the Israeli and Palestinian data here. This is from our joint survey, the one that I conduct together with my Palestinian colleague I mentioned before. We conducted this, the most recent one in July 2024. And what I'm showing you all of the longer history of this question, so you can see that at a certain point, for most of Netanyahu's time as prime minister, by the way, you had a majority on both sides in those first years who supported the concept, the general concept of a two-state solution, both Israelis and Palestinians. It was declining over time. I want to point out, let's see if I can get the mouse to work, clicker to work. Oh, here we are. Okay. So already by 2017, you lost the majority on both sides, okay? And the majority were becoming opposed to it. And the findings were worse than ever in 2020 and 2022, okay? And early 2023, I mean, only a third on both sides who supported it. Now, among Israelis, that number continued to decline during the war, went down from 33 to 31%. I can tell you that among Israeli Jews, okay, if I just look at Israeli Jews, only 21% currently support the two-state solution. Among Palestinians, we actually saw a small rise, but it's a pretty moderate rise, just 6 points. And, you know, it's still a minority. We're still looking at a very desperate situation when it comes to this, what I consider the barometer question. Oh, sorry, let's see if I can move this one ahead. Another quick one, that's very much related to feasibility. Okay, the reason is because over time, when we ask people, we say, you know, some people think that the two-state solution is no longer possible because of political developments and settlements. What do you think? Is it viable or not viable? Well, Palestinians didn't really think it was viable even when we started asking this question a while ago. But look how many didn't think it was viable already in December 2022. Again, a slight decline, a slight improvement for viability, but still overwhelmingly the majority say it's not viable. And on the Israeli side, if a plurality, almost half, thought it was viable a few years ago, that was going down already. And the same trend has been exaggerated since the war. Okay, so this was already at a low point in December 2022, our last joint survey. This was the worst data we had seen so far. Half thought it was no longer viable among Israeli Jews. Only a third said it was, and that's gone down to just 19%. Bless them. Palestinian citizens of Israel or Israeli Arabs always are more optimistic about a two-state solution or anything related to peace or concessions. And even they lost the sense of feasibility, a major drop over time, but still went back up a little bit to close to 60%. So I'm not going to, you know, we have lots of data I could get through, but I want to make the point that cycles of violence do not increase support for peace. They mainly either cause people to oppose it because they say we can't trust the other side, or people who say we would like to get to peace. We simply don't see how it's viable now. It's not viable at all. In fact, those cycles encourage people to vote for hardline leaders in Israel, where we have elections, many elections, too many elections. And the more we have cycles of violence, the more that reinforces people's likelihood of voting for hardline leaders who amplify the militant messages, combined with a sense of complacency in the international community, lack of urgency. There's no influential political leader in Israel now who is even making the case for diplomacy, negotiations, or peace. And in terms of negotiations, since we're on the topic, Israelis and Palestinians don't remember them. They don't have any faith in them. They don't place hopes in them. They don't see them as an alternative. The only time Israelis hear about peace negotiations these days is when we pollsters ask them about it. Okay. And what we found is that, you know, for years, people still supported negotiations, but they just didn't think they would work. So this is only Israelis. These are my colleagues. These are surveys by my colleagues over at Tel Aviv University, the long-running Peace Index survey. And what we saw is, you know, even in August and September of 2023, okay, this is just before the war, we already saw that there were not, you know, still not a majority of Jews and only 80% of Palestinians. So we had over like 52, 53% of or a little higher, 55% of Israelis who supported negotiations. That dropped by half among Israeli Jews in the first months of the war. In the first month of the war, I should say. And then the question of whether people believe negotiations will work, you can see it was very, see, how do I go back? It was very low to begin with. Okay, there was always this contrast of support for negotiations, but very low belief in their efficacy, right? Just 17% of Israeli Jews, and even among Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinians in Israel, barely 40% who thought they would actually be able to reach a peace agreement. Well, they always get somehow more optimistic. It's amazing. But among Israeli Jews, that number went down to the single digits. So the war is essentially bad for people's support, even for negotiations, and certainly for their sense of efficacy, which means each side is sticking to their maximalist positions. If anybody's following the anguish of the cycles of negotiations over the hostage release ceasefire deal, are people following that pretty closely? I mean, it's, you know, it causes anguish for Israelis because people are desperate to see the hostages back with their families. And each time, you know, for many of these months, we thought this is it. They're going to get there, and they never got there. But what I noticed analyzing those negotiations is they started to look a lot like the long-term Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, with each side sticking to maximalist positions, each side putting conditions that the other one could never agree to, and then blaming the other side for the failure. And essentially, the agreement never coming to fruition, which leads to deadly consequences, in this case, hostages dying. So the continuity aspect of this shows how cycles of violence are self-reinforcing. They militate towards ongoing war as well. We forget about diplomacy. We don't have the urgency that force and violence becomes all we know how to do, because we just don't remember any other means of trying to move ahead. So I admit that this is a tough analysis, but I will say that the analysis of the continuity part of it, the cycles, the repetitive nature of the processes that have been in place all these years that have led us to where we are now, I actually think it should provide us a bit of clarity. If we see exactly which aspects repeat themselves and lead us each time to a new war, maybe we can just point out exactly which things need to change. Like all of those things that I just mentioned, just change them. Stop the cycle of violence, have successful negotiations, have constructive international pressure. Okay, that sounds a little bit too easy. But I do think we can try to move now towards understanding where there are opportunities. Sometimes I think opportunity sounds a little bit like overstating the case. I would say more clarity, tools, pathways, and choices that could be made to move towards a more peaceful future. The first one I would say is understanding more what the belligerent parties want. And again, I'm focusing more on Israel, but the same question needs to be asked of all the actors involved. In Israel, I think there is something new and unprecedented that I did not mention in the unprecedented part of this talk. And that predates the war by nearly a year. What is new about this government, and I see it all the time, but I'm just going to go back to the governing guidelines. In Israel, we publish, each coalition government that is formed has a set of guidelines, which they call their basic principles, and they publish them along with the coalition agreements. The 37th government of Israel, this government established in late December 2022, was the first Israeli government, I would argue, I can't think of any exception, that openly stated its aims with regards to occupied territory, particularly West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, but particularly West Bank, Judea and Samaria, which of course means stating what it aims to do for the fate of Palestinians, although they didn't put it like that. The aim was permanent, exclusive Jewish sovereignty over all the land, including in Judea and Samaria. I'm going to show you, because you don't have to believe me. Hebrew speakers, you got it right there. This is copied from the published government guidelines. I didn't have to, this is public for everybody to see. The first item in the government's guidelines says the Jewish people have the exclusive and inalienable right to the entire land of Israel. The government will advance and develop settlements in all parts of the land of Israel, in the Galilee, Negev, Golan, and Judea and Samaria. Okay, you can't get clearer than this. And frankly, no Israeli government has ever stated so clearly what they wanted to do. It goes on to talk about advancing the plans for extending Israeli sovereignty. Every Israeli government up until now, since 1967, has kind of left it open. This is one of the flaws of Israeli decision-making. Everything, all the most controversial aspects exist in a gray zone. We don't actually say. We don't have a constitution. We don't really have final borders in the eastern areas. So why does this matter? Because now we know. We know that the government is not arguing that the occupation is temporary, that there can be a peace process when the conditions are ripe. We know what they're trying to do, certainly in the West Bank. And therefore, when this government speaks openly about annexing Gaza and rebuilding settlements there, believe it. Likud ministers, members of the ruling party, and senior government officials have participated in at least 3 different public conferences calling for annexation and rebuilding settlements. One in January, one in August. I went to that one to see it, and one just a couple of weeks ago. And again, these are attended by lots of extreme figures, including the more extreme members of the Israeli coalition. But Likud is always there, oftentimes as speakers, members of the government from Likud. And there's a precedent for that too. From 1967, Israel has settled, openly annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, immediately began with settlements in the West Bank, and basically stayed the course, other than 2 important withdrawals from Sinai and the dismantling of settlements from Gaza. But the West Bank settlements have stayed the course, right, through remarkable levels of international criticism. And ultimately, nothing has really succeeded in, reaching that deal that would have stopped the extension of settlements, which brings the extension of Israeli infrastructure and the army, and essentially leads to de facto annexation. This government has also been clear about another thing, and the Israeli public realized it on January 4th. I think it was the 4th when the government, 2023, when the government published its plans for judicial reform. But it became clear that in order to advance these aims, many of which would violate international law, of course, settlements violate international law, but also would be subject to challenges by Israeli petitioners. The government made it very clear that it's willing to destroy state institutions, guardrails, gatekeepers, particularly the judiciary, but also pressure on the media, civil society, political critics, the Arab or Palestinian minority in Israel, anything that would criticize or hold back its plans in order to advance a less liberal state, an unequal state, a permanent, essentially, military, authoritarian, hostile rule over Palestinians, and judging what's happening in the north, expulsion, certainly. Let me go on to the regional escalation. We're pretty clear about that too. The regional escalation is real. The belligerence is multi-directional, okay? And from Israel's perspective, the government tries to make a complete distinction as if these things are disconnected. Netanyahu certainly hopes that the US will get pulled into a regional conflict. That's been an aim of his for a long time, so that the US will, take on part of the military effort to attack Iran. But there's a continuity there too. The aim of the military escalations is partly about distracting the Palestinian issue, right? While the regional escalations go on, you don't see too many headlines about Gaza and the West Bank. The idea of distracting from Palestinian strategy, we should know about that by now. We should have seen the results of that following even a peaceful set of agreements with the Abraham Accords that were distracting us from the Palestinian issue. We're paying the price for that. I don't want to blame the Abraham Accords, but they certainly fed into it. I mean, Hamas themselves have said that preventing normalization from continuing with Saudi Arabia was one of its aims. This distraction strategy, I think we can put a spotlight on it, name it, and it has to change. So we know the political obstacles among Palestinians: an epic lack of leadership, total leadership failure, division, loss of legitimacy among their own people, illegitimate use of force, right? Violations of international law, war crimes against Israeli civilians. Israeli leadership, we know their aims. They're saying it openly. They're doing it on the ground. What's going on in northern Gaza over the last few days is the most extreme example. Nobody can say we don't know or don't believe that these are their real aims. If I hear anybody leave this room saying, oh, they're just posturing, I will say you haven't been listening. I think that the conclusion there is that Israel doesn't want to end the war because this government wants to achieve those aims with a clear-eyed view of those political obstacles, which I know are probably difficult. Now I want to move to what I actually do think are something like opportunities, or at least, again, choices that can be made along the way. One opportunity is global urgency. There is more urgency than there was at any time recently. And that's in a way tragic because Hamas can very easily tell its people, we were right. That's probably why we see a rise in Palestinian optimism that there might be viability to negotiations. Western countries, the US, Arab countries have all revived talk about a two-state solution. Again, Palestinians may have a little more of a sense that this could be happening, which is good because it might galvanize them to start thinking about how to revamp their leadership, which is desperately needed for for them to live, with self-governance and self-determination, and also to facilitate anything, a future of negotiations and a two-state solution. There has to be Palestinian leadership. So if this momentum, or what looks not even momentum, but let's say increased attention or urgency towards reaching a two-state solution has, the effect of galvanizing Palestinians to think about their future and leadership, that can contribute to it. From Israelis, it's increasingly common, actually, to hear even senior political leaders, and again, even within the government, and the opposition, which isn't much of an opposition these days, former military figures saying that wars only end with some sort of diplomatic aim. That's okay to say in Israel. Nobody talks about peace. Nobody talks about Palestinian state, but it's okay politically, even from within the government. Even the defense minister can criticize the government and say, we need a political aim for this war, a diplomatic political aim. It's one word in Hebrew, very economical language, medini. And I think that if Israelis have accepted that, Palestinians already would like to have self-determination. There can be a re-legitimization of diplomacy at a time like this, because everybody realizes that if the war goes on forever, it's a forever war. And one Israeli set of opinions has been fairly consistent. that could lead towards this, and that is support for a hostage release deal. In every survey that's been conducted throughout this time, no matter what kinds of trade-offs are tested, more Israelis prefer a hostage deal than want to, whatever the other thing is that's being tested, whether it's going into Rafah, or whether it includes a ceasefire, or whether it includes even a complete end to the war. The majority tend to support the ceasefire deal or a plurality. I think we can look to the past for some of the mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes has been always trying to move ahead towards a gray zone, another interim step, another partial step, never naming final status. I say this because it feels very urgent right now. What we're seeing over the last couple of days is the potential for a hostage release ceasefire deal that's like 4 hostages, and 2 weeks of a ceasefire, or these very limited, never name the end game kind of interim deals. Don't we know from looking at everything that's contributed to the current cycles that has been a failed strategy? So piecemeal, interim, and incrementalism without ever naming the final status, I think we should all know by now has been a failed strategy that needs to change. The long-term end of the fighting will involve long-term solutions. Israeli withdrawal of forces. Israel can't do that unless somebody takes power there. Israel will certainly not let Hamas stay in power there. Probably there will have to be a transition of power with an alternative administration. I've been arguing since the beginning of this war that it should be some sort of an international multilateral intervention. What's interesting is that over time, it seems to be a kind of last resort. Nobody can think of anything better, right? As a transitional administration of some level. I've had Palestinian colleagues working on this issue. Polling among Israelis and Palestinians has shown that is one of the more popular items. Popular would be overstating the case because nothing gets a majority from anybody. Everybody's depressed, but it's one of the options for who should rule Gaza next that is somewhat supported, depending on how you ask it. Certainly a little more among Israelis. The United Arab Emirates has openly named the conditions under which it would be willing to participate in this kind of an international transitional administration of some sort, and particularly if Palestinians invite them in. But also, anything like that is conditional on there being a long-term horizon for a comprehensive political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I just argued was more on the agenda now, mostly based on the idea of a two-state solution. Again, Palestinian state, self-determination. None of those interim things can happen because no state will invest the kind of money and time and effort, and particularly money, in Gaza, in the reconstruction of Gaza, or the stabilization of Gaza, or putting peacekeeping forces or troops at risk if there isn't a long-term horizon for Palestinians living under self-governance, under independence. I will also say that a long-term horizon for peace with Israelis and Palestinians could de-escalate the north. Israel doesn't like that linkage. Of course, Prime Minister rejects that linkage. But the reality is that if Gaza de-escalates, there is more likelihood that the American envoy, who has been shuttling back and forth this whole year, Amos Hochstein, might be successful at reaching a renewed political arrangement, something along the lines of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was not so unsuccessful. I mean, the northern border was among Israel's quietest borders from 2006 until the present. So it needs to be revamped, it needs to be improved. But in many ways, the terms are kind of known. I think the biggest sticking point is that the two sides can't agree about linking or delinking the fronts. The Gaza war needs to end for its own sake, for all the reasons I've just said. And the benefit will be that helps de-escalate the north. But again, all of this depends on the commitment to final status based on Palestinian self-determination. Why do I think this is even remotely realistic when we remember that only 30% of Israelis support a two-state solution, only 21% of Israeli Jews, even among Palestinians, only 40%. Well, if you think of that bigger context that I've just tried to illustrate, we've tested in our July survey something similar. Now, it's not all about public opinion, but I do want to illustrate where there is potential here. We asked the question, if the choice is between a regional war that includes Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Lebanon, Yemen, possibly Iran, this was in July, okay, when there wasn't yet this recent exchange of fire, or a regional peace deal that includes a Palestinian-Israeli agreement based on a two-state solution, the one that just a few minutes before most Israelis and Palestinians had rejected in our survey, okay? and Arab-Israeli normalization, okay, which most people hear in their minds as Saudi Arabia. What's your preference? Now, you might think, well, anybody would choose peace over war, not to be taken for granted in the current environment in Israel, where the leadership and many people and influential people and commentators and social media and the general environment has come to converge around the idea that there must be a war in order for Israelis to have security. But when we put it like this, these are your choices. Okay, what we see is that among Palestinians and among Israelis, you have a majority who prefer the two-state solution that they just rejected. When they have the incentive of normalization with, I think they hear in their minds Saudi Arabia, but maybe other Arab states. And they know that the alternative, the pressure side of the equation, is a very severe regional war. So again, you have, an overwhelming majority, overwhelming, let's say a firm majority of about 2/3 among Palestinians, very little difference between Gaza and the West Bank. And among all Israelis, similar number, 62% in total. Even among Israeli Jews who are, more militant and much more hardline, you have a majority, absolute majority of 55% who support it. And among Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arab Israelis, a consensus in survey terms of about 90%. Again, that just to reiterate that this is the population, Arab citizens of Israel, who always, across the board, support everything to do with peace and oppose everything to do with violence by, almost consensus attitudes. So I think that if this were to happen, the first thing that would happen in Israel is that it would crash the Israeli government. It would be like, computer crash, like systems overload. This Israeli government will crack up even if there is a hostage release deal. Okay, at least that's what the most furthest right coalition partners have threatened. If that happens, 2 for 1. The Israeli government collapses. Israel goes into elections. Okay, by all survey research, and I've been, tracking every single political survey that's come out since since October 7th, what we see is a convergence right now, not around the extreme right, but around what Israelis consider to be the center right. So if elections were held today, they are not held today. I don't know what will happen in 2 years when the elections will be held. But if they were to happen today, most likely it's these sort of, I would say, hawkish, secular center right, but really right wing. They are right wing parties, but they're not as ideologically driven in terms of their religious orientation. They're mostly secular parties. And they're certainly not as driven by personal political interests like Netanyahu, who's desperate to stay in power, partly for his corruption cases that are ongoing. If that kind of government is established, it will be somewhat more pragmatic in the sense of not wanting to alienate all of Israel's foreign relations, in the sense of wanting to capitalize on the incentives of regional normalization. And if it's led by someone like Benny Gantz, who is currently the front runner and has been, the top opposition party of existing parties, he simply has less political backbone and defiance, unlike Netanyahu. And so there is a kind of scenario. It's like a pathway. I hesitate to call it an opportunity, but it's certainly a potential pathway. Another point of change, okay, another proposal that I think is critical for understanding how to move ahead is that if there is a future for the two-state solution, it has to be updated. Why do I say that? Because we weren't able to get it. Each round of negotiations for the partition-based two-state solution with a hard partition and international border between two societies that are already intertwined, interdependent in a single space, have failed. Why did they fail? Because the two sides weren't willing to give up on key issues that would allow them to hermetically separate. Okay, that's why I am a member of an organization, but I also individually support two states. You need two sides to have national self-determination, roughly in geographical territories, but recognizing the reality of interdependence, recognizing that there need to be institutions for limited areas of shared governance, especially on policy areas where they are interdependent, economic issues, security issues. You need to be able to recognize that there are people who will want to live on the other side. They can live there as residents, but they will be citizens of their own country. These societies need to share, policy on things like resources, climate, water, public health. Remember Corona? Not that long ago. Remember polio? I hope you do, because it's coming back. It is. It's not a joke. It's in Gaza. The vaccination campaign that Israel was coordinating with local Gazans, and the WHO and the UN has been suspended because of in the north because of the security situation. I mean, it's hard to believe we're saying these words, but they have no choice but to coordinate on these things. There should be governing structures that organically recognize the need for that partnership, two states on equal footing, equal political footing, with the kind of openness and opportunity and needs-based cooperation that the situation demands. Regional de-escalation. We did a series of regional agreements. Like I said, defusing the northern border Palestinian state in the context of the two-state solution with multilateral backing. If it's backed by the UAE, by Arab states, Middle East, US, Europe, you have a new kind of supportive basis for Israel to take steps that it doesn't really want to take, that it's scared to take with Palestinians. And the bonus is that if you defuse the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and move towards Palestinian self-determination, I'm going to move to the summary slide, you essentially remove one of the greatest mobilizing forces for Iran and Iran's axis. Okay, I don't think it's crazy when the prime minister talks about Iran, mobilizing that whole axis and supporting that axis to be hostile to Israel's existence. These are very real things. We live under the, UAVs and bombs and drones that have been coming in, and so we know that these are real. It's not just propaganda, and there's no easy answer to solve everything in the Middle East. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and specifically the lack of self-determination for Palestinians, is one of the greatest mobilizing forces, ideological mobilizing forces. It is exploited cynically by the Iranian network in order to recruit and mobilize. Take that away, advance, re-legitimize diplomacy, not only between the two of them, but in the Middle East at large. Capitalize on renewed diplomacy between Iran and these potential normalization partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And you might have an opening for diplomacy with Iran as well. What we do know is that maximum pressure, sanctions, leaving the Iran deal that was signed under Obama has not worked. Killing Qasem Soleimani in 2020, we're more threatened by Iran now than ever before. We're actually being fired on. Iran is closer than ever to having nuclear weapons than ever before, and it has more incentive to get there. So we definitely need to change that paradigm. Listen, this is a summary of just all the recommendations that I've made in terms of how to move forward. I want to just emphasize, these are incredibly remote scenarios, okay? They're a wish list. They're not easy, they're not perfect. There will never be perfect security, not in the Middle East, nowhere in the world. But what we know is that regional leaders in Israel and Palestine are not going to do it on their own. Israel doesn't want to. Israel's government doesn't want to. The Palestinian leadership doesn't really exist. Iran is in battle mode. I think some of these scenarios can happen, however, if there is a wise US leadership in the future. Regional partnership, a willingness to use both pressure and incentives, not just cajole or contradict, and a refusal to give up on this vision. This is the alternative. It's either the wish list or the forever war. Thank you.
So we're going to shift to questions, and we'll be taking questions both from the audience and from folks watching Zoom. Thank you so much, Dahlia.
I went over time, didn't I?
Well, I think it's just helpful to have some sense of the cartography of whether and what sort of possible ways out of the disaster there are. Let me begin so I'll sort of try and be looking both at my screen and at you all, but I'll begin with a question that I think speaks directly to where you ended. Zach Berger asks, the speaker talked about what the US hasn't done. I'm curious what decisions he thinks are possible in shaping war versus forever war versus peace. And I take it he means particularly by the US. And maybe we can sort of extend that more generally to sort of ask you to maybe think concretely about how you see the levers, the possible players, and using those levers to open up these possibilities regardless of what the current Israeli regime wants. Yeah. And what the Palestinians can or can't want.
Yeah, it's a very tough answer because it seems like there's limited options. I mean, the one thing the US hasn't actually done is take the pressure mode, right? The US has done lots of incentives, lots of bear hug, right? The bear hug concept, if anybody's not familiar with our little lingo, is that, the US gives so much support that it should have the credibility to tell Israel or ask Israel to, follow its red lines, at least. We saw that that didn't work. And so it seems like the only thing left is for the US to take steps that would constrain Israel in terms of policy, not just by signaling or symbolizing things. And I think that the US political environment is so constrained, especially during the election time, but maybe, during the lame duck period, there's an opportunity and the next president will have to make a serious choice. But what we know is that in the past, in previous administrations, including Republican administrations, there have been much more significant forms of pressure that didn't damage Israel's security, but were really difficult for Israel to cope with. And the classic example we all go back to is in the early 1990s under the Bush administration, when America said, we don't want you to build new housing in the occupied territories for all these, for the roughly 1 million who were estimated to start arriving from the former Soviet Union. So we're going to withhold loan guarantees that you desperately need to be able to take those loans. And it essentially, not only did it constrain Israel's actions, but it also, and I didn't realize this myself until recently, it also was a significant factor in the 1992 elections, because people felt like the Shamir government was really endangering the US-Israel relationship. Now, there's been a lot of talk, and so some people consider it at the time, if you read commentary at the time, there was a sense that that was one of the reasons why Yitzhak Rabin won. People were worried that Shamir was going to endanger that relationship for that reason. And Rabin quickly defused that and said, okay, we won't build in the settlements. Never mind that, of course, Israel continued building in settlements. But I think that the US does have more room to take pressure actions. The problem is that the US right now sees them in such incremental ways that don't actually change Israeli policy. And so sanctioning a few settlers in the West Bank because they're violent doesn't change the strategy in Gaza. A delay of one weapons shipment certainly hasn't constrained Israel's policy elsewhere. The number one, I think the easiest and most, not just easiest, the most logical thing to do would be to apply US law. US laws exist about the export of weapons, whether it's the Leahy laws or the National Security Memo 20, which I mentioned before, that basically says there have to be constraints on weapons exports and assurances that those weapons are not being used to violate for egregious violations of human rights, and they are applied for other countries that are recipients, countries that are in conflict, active war. Ukraine, they're applied on Ukraine. So the problem is Israeli exceptionalism in American policy. Israel simply isn't subject to the same controls that every other recipient of US foreign aid and military aid is. Why is that? I don't think it's healthy for Israel to be seen always exceptionally. This is a very severe situation, but I think that's the most basic. It also makes a mockery of US law. It feeds the sense that, that US law and diplomacy is inconsistently applied. And that taps into a bigger problem with international law, the international system, the rules-based order, which is frankly has been under severe strain. And there's always been a problem of hypocrisy and unequal application. And, the stronger parties do better under the international system. And the US hasn't signed, on the Rome Statute for the ICC. And, lots of hypocrisies over the years. But now we're seeing something like the collapse of the international system. And it is on the verge of collapse because of the three major conflicts that I mentioned. It has been completely ineffective. And unequal application of these laws or standards is one of the reasons. So I would say at the very least, America has to apply American laws to the export of weapons.
A follow-up question to that, and then I'll turn to the audience. One alternative to the idea that international law will actually be enforced and will actually have some kind of grip in this conflict, I suppose the question sort of stems from a set of propositions that may not be correct, but there's a strange way, but maybe they are, and that they claim this sort of that actually China, the US, and Russia should all have, I mean, in a world where there's no long, where we're now, I don't know, reduced to something like a 19th century sort of contention amongst warring powers, this actually seems like one of the very few issues where you would think all of them would want something other than this level of credible violence. Or at least they say they do, right? I mean, maybe the Russians are getting their missiles from the Iranians, but what is there any kind of prospect to your mind
for those three?
For those three, or at least for the Chinese and the US?
I mean, put it this way: the short answer is probably not. But I would say that even in the beginning of this war, when I was advocating early on, I mentioned for an international intervention. And I looked at my experiences in the Balkans because I'm very, I worked very closely on and spent a lot of time in Kosovo. And it was not a coincidence that anybody who started thinking about international interventions went to Kosovo in their minds, because there was a two-pronged international intervention. It had a security prong with KFOR, the NATO force that came in to keep the peace with, armed, and it was an actual administration that helped build a grassroots, I should say, local Kosovo-led government, but kind of like an incubator, and really train them in governance, which they wanted, right? So there were these two prongs that really helped, and it was also realistic, right? That according to the arrangement, and I'm getting to how this was actually defined, there was even a possibility that Serbia might have to go back in if there were severe situations of, security need. And it didn't really, for the most part, didn't happen. But that was in the definition of the mission. Where was the mission defined? In a UN Security Council resolution. And so people said to me, well, it can never happen because Russia and China would veto it. Well, they managed to agree back then. I think it was China abstained and Russia agreed to it. So, okay, it was a different time. It does look much less auspicious now, but things like that have happened. The problem is I don't hear Russia and China really calling for peace. Russia is deeply, deeply, engaged in its war. It wants the, Iranian, it doesn't even have such leverage over Iran for the reasons you said. China is much more transactional. China buys oil, right, from Iran. That is one of Iran's major sources of income. It's actually very low on the level of places where China imports from. So China could theoretically stop buying, but it doesn't have an interest in that. It's very transactional in the Middle East. So I have a hard time seeing that particular configuration. But there is one more point I wanted to mention about what America should do. And I know people want to think about hard policy steps, which is what I started with. But I personally have noticed that in the earliest stages of the war, when I argued that there was a new urgency and everybody was talking about getting back to a comprehensive resolution, two-state solution, the president was talking about it, the Secretary of State was talking about it. Where are they? They stopped talking about it. I have not heard them say the words two-state solution or even any comprehensive political resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in months, maybe not for most of 2024. And I think I know why they stopped. Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't want them to talk about it. Okay, so Kamala Harris, vice president and candidate, and hopefully next president. I think you all know where my political sympathies lie, even though I'm here in an analytic hat. She has said it occasionally, including in her acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. But the fact that it's come now, as part of the campaign trail, and not actually in an active, simply making it clear that you're not going to give up on your basic positions, which America has done time and again, is quite shocking. America has much more leverage over Israel. Again, overwhelming political, military, and diplomatic, military and economic support. Any of those things give leverage that America hasn't been willing to use.
I think I saw a hand over here. Gentleman in the green jacket. Yeah.
Yeah.
But please speak into the mic, apparently.
Oh, Mike, wonderful. That's better. Couple questions. As far as the hostages go, it strikes me that the hostages are the only weapon that the Palestinians have left, and it seems very unlikely to me that they want to give those up. And I think that's kind of a stumbling block in the whole peace process. And another question is, I guess you've tried to explain, I still don't fully understand why. The Palestinians have general support throughout the common people in most countries. And I've talked to people from different countries, that's just our countries, whereas almost all governments and elites are still, despite what we see every night on TV, they're still very supportive of Israel. I'm wondering if you have an explanation for that, and what is it going to take before some of these governments, including our own will probably be the last, to stop supporting Israel?
Okay. Good questions. I think that, for one thing, when you say the Palestinians don't want to give up on the hostages, let's all distinguish between leadership and people. Okay. I think that it is extremely dangerous to say all Palestinians are not innocent in Gaza, or that all Israelis are implicated in the war. And by the same logic, I say, Hamas undertook October 7th, and, we can look at the polls and what they think about Hamas, but I do make that distinction. I think that Hamas has indicated any number of times. I do think both sides, I'm not a both siders, but from what we can tell of the negotiations, there have been junctures at which Hamas was, more stonewalling the negotiations, and junctures at which Netanyahu clearly did not want to get to an agreement. So I would say it breaks down about half and half. But Hamas has indicated numerous times that they are willing to give up on the hostages. Their condition is a full ceasefire, full withdrawal. They don't have any interest in keeping the hostages just for their own sake. In fact, most of us think the first hostage deal came around because Hamas was a little too successful in taking civilians, children, elderly. They didn't really want them. They couldn't even, kind of keep track of all of them. And even now, so now it's they would still have to, locate them. But their condition is that the war actually be over. And so I don't think it's a matter of them not wanting to give them up for leverage, but yes, they are leverage on some level to getting to that point. And I think that the Israeli government's reticence to get to a hostage release deal is largely for that reason, because Israel wants to take away that leverage because it doesn't want to end the war for the reasons that I've talked about. You're absolutely correct to point out the gap between publics and leaders. This is especially prominent in the Middle East. In the Middle East, you have massive public fury at Israel and at the US. I should point out, if anybody's not clear, I talk to people from the Middle East, they say this is America's war. They see it as America's war. And there have been demonstrations, and there have been suppression of demonstrations. Jordan in particular is facing a lot of criticism. Other countries too, these are repressive governments, right? Their freedom of expression is not where they excel. And that gap is there. But I would qualify two things. I think that I'd like to, from what the UAE has put out there, and their offer to be involved in some sort of a transitional authority, an intervention was public. That was made public in an op-ed in the Financial Times in July. They laid out the conditions they would do it. I wonder, I'd like to think that some of those governments that were involved in the Abraham Accords thinking we can have our transactional relations with Israel, which we need the intelligence cooperation. We like the possibility of weapons sales, all sorts of, and maybe like little perks of tourism and economic and trade. We don't have to worry about those pesky Palestinians. I'd like to think that they realize that you can't ignore this issue. It is destabilizing the entire Middle East. It is making their relations with Israel tougher. It is changing their entire understanding of America's role in the Middle East, and it's destabilizing the whole region. So I'd like to think that it's not, personally, I also don't consider it a matter of whether they're pro-Israel or against Israel. Personally, I think the best thing, the most pro-Israel position would be to end this war and get to a series of regional agreements and get the hostages back and, all the things I mentioned. I think that's the most pro-Israel. But I realize that shift, that semantic shift never really caught on. When we say pro-Israel, we mean supporting the government, Netanyahu, ongoing, occupation and de facto annexation. And so I think that the governments of the Middle East, focusing on them, I think that they would see, they need to see that it's in their self-interest to de-escalate the region. And the only way to do that is through a series of diplomatic agreements, not through a forever war.
Steve.
Thank you. In your Foreign Affairs article, you note that Netanyahu's chief goal in overhauling the judiciary was to move forward with annexation. My recollection is that even though there was widespread protest in Israel against his effort to weaken the judiciary, the question of Palestinian self-determination didn't loom large in those protests, which surprised and disappointed me, to be honest. I thought perhaps there was still a remnant of the Israeli left. And so if there was such an absence of concern for Palestinians before October 7th, why should we expect a change of heart after, a traumatic threat to Israeli security? So my question isn't so much about political arrangements as it is about public opinion and the capacity for, if nothing else, recognizing each other's trauma and seeing each other's humanity. Do you see any opening of that kind in Israel and Palestine's future?
Thank you. And thank you for also mentioning the article and for reading it. Shameless self-promotion. I have an article in the current print edition of Foreign Affairs, and it is somewhat optimistic, right? It's a renewal proposal. But I think that is I would just add, I don't think that annexation was the only reason for the judicial reform. And let me clarify, the judicial overhaul, the attempt to constrain and essentially undercut the ability of gatekeepers to constrain the Israeli state was intended to advance annexation, but also to advance Jewish privilege, superiority, supremacy, whatever you want to call it, anchored by law, as articulated already in Israel's basic laws. It was to advance a more theocratic society, which, four of the parties in the 5 parties of the coalition are theocratic parties, and that is their agenda. Netanyahu doesn't really care as long as he stays in power. And, you can add other things, undercut the welfare state, constrain civil society and the media, constrain anything like opposition, which is needed in order to advance the other things. And so I would say the focus on the judiciary was intended to, kind of create an insurance policy to enable the government to do all of those things. In terms of, and you're absolutely right that during the massive and really also unprecedented enduring protests against that overhaul, and the assault on democratic institutions, there was very little mention of anything to do with the conflict, occupation, Palestinians. It's not true that there was none. If you visited, you maybe know that there was every single week a corner of the long boulevard where all the anti-occupation activists would go and try to make the case that this is integrally connected. And as I argue in the piece and in my book as well, the flaws, the missing pieces, the missing pillars of Israeli democracy are very fundamentally about the situation of Palestinians, whether it's citizens or non-citizens, before the occupation as well. This is one of the fundamental questions Israel could never answer, because it would mean choosing between a commitment to liberal democratic principles or democratic principles, even if it's not a fully liberal society, and Palestinian recognition, self-determination, equality, et cetera. So we tried to, yes, I was among them. We tried to make that case, make the connection. I don't think Israelis are about to have a change of heart. Okay, they're not going to feel kind toward Palestinians at large. We see no evidence of that. In fact, if I were to show you more data from the joint survey we conducted in July, you would see that the levels of dehumanization, mutual, are extremely high. And they are a mirror image. And the levels of perception that the other side has the most extreme aspirations in this conflict, they are a mirror image. And the other really chilling question is, what do you think the other side was trying to do? In other words, we asked Israelis, what do you think Palestinians were trying to do on October 7th? And we asked Palestinians, what do you think Israel's trying to do in the current war? Over 60% on both sides think that the other side is trying to commit genocide. So no, I do not expect a change of heart, but I do see Israelis having in 2023 recognized that the same people trying to undercut democracy, which they worried was going to affect them personally, were the same people advancing the mission, driven by theocratic messianic principles of territorial expansion, of controlling Palestinians forever. They didn't want to think about it, but they were starting to realize that Israel is missing some basic pillars, and it was the same people. It's kind of a juxtaposition, even if they didn't make the connection. Now, I think we're seeing something much more clearly, which is that the government is in a kind of frenzied euphoria, literally euphoria. We have ministers saying these are miraculous times, because Israel has the possibility of reclaiming Gaza, rebuilding settlements. When I went to one of these conferences, people were talking in beatific tones about resettling Gaza, and Israelis are watching that and realizing that the war serves them for that purpose, not for and that purpose means abandoning the hostages. So I think they're starting to make the connection between these things, but it will be a very long-term process, almost as long as the history of these missing pieces of democracy. So it is a very long-term process. The stakes are much more urgent and much higher now. But I do think that Israelis are starting to realize that if the government is able to move ahead in the way that it wants, which is continuing the war, right? All those processes that militate towards ongoing war, completing the annexation of the West Bank, annexing Gaza, expelling, committing, honestly, it is war crimes, because they're expelling people and, have blocked humanitarian aid, destroyed the medical system, ceased the vaccination programs, on all of this in the northern part of Gaza right now. And they are saying openly that the purpose is combined with these people who want to resettle Gaza. So that under any definition of international law, it's a war crime. And I think Israelis are starting to realize, okay, this isn't just the international community telling us you're bad, you're violating international law. They see themselves that it's not for a purpose that serves the country. It's for the purpose of religiously driven territorial expansion and rebuilding settlements. And for that purpose, the government is both willing to pass a whole slew of new anti-democratic laws and continue the war and sacrifice the life of the hostages. And it's the hostages that have the most, that cause is the greatest like bleeding wound, in Israeli society. So no, it's not going to be out of love for the Palestinians, but more a sense of like, where is this taking the country?
Well, oh, sorry, please, wait. Yeah, and there's a mic.
Thank you. Specifically, I'm interested in what you just touched on now about the dehumanization aspect between Israelis and Palestinians, and I guess the role that the media is playing in that. Obviously now, a few days away from the US election, we're having a lot of conversations about the role of media. And I'm sure you saw on Friday night when Dani Kushmaro found himself in Lebanon having a blast. So I'm curious about why or how you find that the Israeli media has kind of been covering the war, what it's kind of chosen to kind of bring into the spotlight, and then how that's kind of compared to other conflict zones that you've covered, and how where the line may blend or become blurry between journalists and citizens of a country.
Well, I love the comparative question, but because this is really a situation I haven't lived through before, it's hard for me to make a direct comparison about media coverage. But of course, I can tell you from the area, from the conflicts that I've worked in, including when it's post-conflict, each side sees their side of the matter, right? Especially when these are unresolved conflicts. But even when, the Balkans is the area I know really best in terms of their mindset, both in terms of public opinion and also in terms of the history of the conflict. Trust me, these sides are not trying to see the other side of the story. And it's, it permeates the discussions and media, and it's just taken for granted that our side is in the right, our side is the victim, the other side is the aggressor, and nobody understands us and everybody's against us. I would say that characterizes the Serb mindset, if I can generalize, but I've done a lot of public opinion research in these places. In terms of the Israeli media, listen, there's no question. In the beginning, I would say I was a little bit more, forgiving in a way, because the trauma was so huge that Israelis didn't know how to cope with it. And they felt the need to tell the stories. Everybody wanted to tell the story. All the media outlets wanted to tell the personal stories. Everybody knows somebody. So it's a very personal society, as you seem to know. And it was emotionally overwhelming. I personally didn't like it. I maybe I'm not a nice person, but I had a hard time, connecting to every long stories about individuals who were killed or wounded or kidnapped. I wanted to know the facts, but I felt like it was an artificial way of connecting. And I felt like it was blocking out critical news time, not only about the Palestinians, but about Israel's own decision makers. What were they thinking about? What were they deciding? What were their strategies? Why aren't they being interviewed for us to hear, all the time? I mean, I think this was a grave problem, and it really just made me realize that that was one problem. The other problem was that Israelis were extremely inward looking. At the best of times, Israel's kind of an insular society, right? A little bit provincial even. I can say that, I'm Israeli. And this was a time when Israelis forgot about the rest of the world entirely. Nothing else existed, including Palestinians. However, I think after a certain amount of time, it became, incomprehensible that I would open my phone and see carnage in Gaza every day, every minute, in every situation. And, in the Israeli media, there's none of that. So that is a huge professional lapse. It's not just a lapse. I mean, some people would consider it really a complete breach of professional ethics. Having said that, I don't think any Israeli is innocent of the responsibility to know. All of us have cell phones. We have over 100% cell phone penetration rate in Israel. Most of it is 3G, 4G, 5G, not 5G, 3G, 4G, whatever we're up to. Everybody has Telegram. Everybody can see what's going on in Gaza. And I think that Palestinians, by the same token, have every responsibility to know what happened on October 7th. Our surveys show that 90% say they have not seen videos of atrocities and don't believe them. That's also a form of denialism, and they should be held responsible for knowing that too. But let's just say Israelis are under a little bit less duress. Not to minimize. I mean, I'm living through it. It's terrible. But I think that, traditional media is only part of the story. Everybody has access to the information if they want it.
Well, maybe I'll, yeah, please go ahead. See. Gentleman here.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg. Yeah. It seems to me that the real problem is Israeli leadership. That, or at least if we assume that the international community is not going to sway the current government and the prime minister, and changes are not going to happen in Palestinian leadership, I don't think, anytime soon. What is it going to take, or is it possible actually for a centrist, as you were talking about, center-left coalition to actually win an election and move, and then once that happens, and I would guess that a two-state solution would not be much part of that campaign.
No.
Right? So is it possible before 2 years are out, or even in 2 years, for that to happen, for Israeli society to reconstitute itself more around the secular center, which I think maybe, I don't know if that's accurate or not. And then and that functioning as sort of the foundation for moving out to peace. It seems like there's no way to get there without that happening.
No, I think that has to happen, but I think, this is going to be the let a thousand flowers bloom, approach to this transition towards moving back to diplomacy and peace negotiations and agreements, because it's not going to be one thing. But of course, that is probably the biggest obstacle. If I didn't make it clear, I do think the political obstacle is the biggest obstacle, and it's an obstacle that applies to every possible political solution that's out there. So people often ask me when I speak about two states and a confederated approach, what about the Israeli political leadership? And I say, yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem for two states, two confederated states, one to anything. It's a political, it is the biggest obstacle. What I talked about, let me just, in case it wasn't clear, the current front runners in Israel are not the center left, it's the center right, right? And these are, again, hawkish militant parties. Some of them were originally to the right of Likud, but now are seen as somewhat more right center only because they're opposed to Netanyahu. So they will have a very hard time putting together, they could put together a coalition pretty easily, because in every single survey since October 7th, the opposition parties are winning in total, especially if you include parties representing Palestinian citizens of Israel, including one that already sat in a coalition government, United Arab Movement. But there's so many ways for that not to work. What often happens in times of war and stress, and especially when there's intimidation against Arab citizens in Israel, is that they don't vote. If they don't vote, they get a lot, it changes the whole balance of what the other parties do, how the other parties do. And they don't have as much, power to augment an opposition coalition. If I can say opposition coalition, you know what I mean, right? Parties that are currently in opposition forming the coalition. Having said that, if they were to recreate the political and coalition building dynamics that they had in 2021, when they were able to form a government, including for the first time ever with the United Arab List joining, they could certainly form a government. The question is, could they govern? Could they withstand the disagreements they will have among them? Probably not, which is why they wouldn't all go into that kind of government. You'd have to have enough without, let's say, Hadash, the remnants of the Communist Party and the Jewish Arab, coalition. And as to your question about, can they actually make a case for a two-state solution, for political resolution, whatever they call it? I mean, here's the thing. If the elections were called now, nobody would be making that case. Nobody, except for the Arab parties. Nobody would be making that case. I don't even think the head of the merged Labor and Meretz party, which is now called the Democrats, his name is Yair Golan, I don't even think he would be making that case. He comes from the army. He's taken a pretty militant approach towards many of the consensus issues like the regional escalation, and everybody's afraid. They're afraid. But here's the thing. They could make that case. They would have to be courageous. They would have to truly believe in it. They would have to have answers for like why we can't go back, why the old two-state solution didn't work. What's your vision now? Personally, I would say 2 states and a confederated approach, but they have to be forward-thinking to get to that. And they have to be willing to pay a political price. They have to think long-term. In short, they have to be leaders. We don't have it right now. If they have 2 years, maybe they'll think about how to become a leader. But so far, this didn't start on October 7th. Benny Gantz has never shown any kind of vision. He's been running we've been living with the guy since 2019, 5 election cycles, and he still has no vision. So I'm not that hopeful, but I think that the need is clear. You have to have leadership who is willing to put their vision out there in a comprehensive and courageous way, boldly, including with political sacrifices and risk.
Let me ask, I mean, in some ways you have pushed us to think in ways that might strangely be more comfortable than some of the things that we ought to be thinking about, in the sense that you've been thinking about sort of what might happen in the next 2 years, or what might happen under the circumstances of some sort of possible regime change in Israel. And I guess
A regime change.
right, that would be right. But I mean, we're certainly living in this moment where I think the general consensus is that we're seeing a massively stepped up campaign of mass ethnic cleansing violence and atrocity, particularly in northern Gaza. And I mean, one of the things that always struck me when we think about these things, that the folks running the show now are perfectly aware that these other alternatives might impede their plans. And in some sense, they have a different sense of the temporality. Now's the time for unbridled, massive, civilian indifferent at best violence. Now's the time to grab that part of the North and make it irreversible, right? And so, so many of the questions in the last couple of minutes have circled around the question of, let's say, your imagined average Israeli Jewish civilian as a political actor. Can this person, despite their incapacity to think about Palestinian humanity in wartime and perhaps beyond wartime, can this person sort of recognize that this sort of forever war is not something that he or she wants for their family either? And 55% say yes, but the people running the military campaign know this too, and they're basically trying to make it impossible for that alternative to kick in anytime, in time to change the situation, right? And I guess so maybe the real question is there any constraint right now on what they're trying to do? If there is a constraint, presumably it must be at some level the kind of the citizen soldiers of the army who are not utterly committed to the sort of settler project, and the military brass and these sorts of people. You read Amos Harel and they're looking for a moment when the military brass, with a certain degree of greater credibility because of their successes at the sort of, tactical level vis-a-vis Hezbollah, can turn to Netanyahu and say, no, we're not going to actually facilitate mass, genocidal ethnic cleansing in the North. And that's not what the army's for, right? But I mean, these are grasping at straws, right? At least in the eyes of many people. So do you have a sense of how the immediate situation is going to resolve?
It doesn't look good. Yeah. It doesn't look good. I mean, international courts have not changed Israel's behavior, right? Israel has continued to do these things. The threat of arrest warrants being issued, which, the special prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has requested those warrants. They haven't been approved yet. We don't exactly know why. We don't know if it would constrain them anyway. And so that's pressure from without. There is no significant American pressure, as I mentioned, right? It's like appearances of a crisis, but essentially blanket support, which goes back to the question of immediate policy actions America should be doing. I talked about the rhetoric in the long term, but America can take those steps if it wanted to. Other forms of outside pressure, I just don't see them. I will say that inside pressure is another area that you mentioned. And, I spent a lot of this week kind of turning over stones in Israeli society to see if there are little, any sort of indications of, are Israelis, realizing, is it getting through? And, there are voices that are talking in more extreme terms about these violations, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. I mean, there are Israelis talking about genocide that have not been before. I'm seeing those conversations. Sometimes they're private conversations. Sometimes they're, I think a lot of people are really saying, are we doing this? But when I say a lot, I don't want to overstate the case. I'm a pollster. When we look at quantitative trends, it is not most Israelis by any stretch. So I don't really expect some great groundswell from the bottom. That leaves two things. One is, some awareness of the international proceedings that has also led to a bit of a conversation about the question of an illegal order. I don't know how widespread this is going to be. I'm paying attention to it this week because I've seen some people out there talking about how these are illegal orders. They're war crimes and illegal orders. And in Israel, we have a doctrine of soldiers are obliged to refuse an illegal order. It almost never happens. Okay. But these are conversations that I did not see happening before. I don't expect them to really make the change. And then there's the level that you mentioned, the higher brass of the army. As we know, the military establishment has been, essentially not aligned with the political level on this, does not support the military, the political aims that we now see emerging from the general's plan and all this stuff. And there has been a sense among, a lot of military analysts that the war should have been managed differently to begin with, that there should have been much more attention to the South where the weapons were coming in to begin with, start with Rafah instead of this, and that the only reason to really focus on the North so much is in order to implement these political plans. There's been, a tension between the top military levels for that reason, but there's a problem. First, Netanyahu has generally not had a great relationship with the military. He doesn't really trust them because he has his political aims. And the way they, he and his government and his sort of, proxy spokespeople spent years traducing and delegitimizing the judiciary. Guess where all that attention has gone in the last year? Against the military. He's tried to blame the military for October 7th. He's blamed them for everything that hasn't worked out right. He's tried to kind of call into question military appointments and all sorts of stuff that makes it seem like the military are the bad guys. Now, if there are senior military people who try to take any sort of stance, they're going to be accused of a coup, of a military coup. They're already accusing them of a military coup if they say anything like that. So it's very difficult to see where those constraints will come in. I wish I had a better answer.
Well, on that note, I think we should probably.
I had good answers before the questions started.
Well, I no, but having a clear-eyed take on this is. Thank you for that, and please join me in thanking our speaker this evening.
Thank you.